The joists under the main floor of the property were solid oak, cut in a century, where builders actually cared about load-bearing capacity and deflection limits. I knew this because I had spent the last 45 minutes wedged in the damp crawl space, my flashlight beam cutting through the dense, earthy smell of wet soil and aged timber. The storm outside was accelerating, the barometric pressure dropping so fast I could feel it as a dull ache behind my eyes. I wiped a streak of condensation from my moisture meter and logged the reading 12%. The foundation wasn't just surviving, it was defiant. I logged the data into my tablet, the harsh blue light illuminating the dust motes suspended in the cramped air. I was supposed to be doing a routine assessment for a corporate buyout, but the numbers weren't adding up to a teardown. Something heavier was shifting above my head, a rhythmic pacing against the floorboards that told me she was still awake, still pacing, still carrying a weight the blueprints didn't account for. I pushed myself backward on the creeper, navigating the narrow exit hatch, and brushed the cobwebs from my gray t-shirt. The wind howled off the lake, throwing sheets of rain against the siding with the force of thrown gravel. I stepped into the mudroom, shaking the chill from my shoulders. The lake house was a sprawling stoic structure, but it was currently a battleground. I placed my tools precisely on the workbench, moisture meter calipers laser level, aligning them at right angles. It was a habit of over-preparation, a triage logic, that kept my mind steady when environments turned chaotic. I heard the pacing stop. The house groaned under a sudden gust, the timbers shifting to absorb the kinetic energy. I needed to finish mapping the upper load paths before the power grid inevitably failed. But a sharp crack from the second floor completely overrode my schedule. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heavy boots silent on the runner. The hallway was dark, save for a sliver of yellow light spilling from the bathroom doorway. Before I could call out her name, the entire house shuddered. A deafening snap echoed above, followed by the terrifying sound of heavy wood tearing through shingles. The lights flickered, hummed violently, and died. Absolute blackness dropped over the house. "Alice," I kept my voice level, cutting through the sudden roar of the rain now hitting the exposed attic space. "I'm here." Her voice was a shaky exhale coming from the floor. I pulled my tactical flashlight from my belt and clicked it on, pointing the beam at the ceiling first to assess the structural threat. A massive branch had pierced the outer roof, but the inner drywall was holding. I swept the light down, diffusing the beam with my hand so it wouldn't blind her. She was sitting on the cold tile floor of the bathroom, her knees pulled up slightly. She had clearly just stepped out of the shower when the impact hit. A thick, white towel was wrapped securely around her, tucked high and tight like a field bandage. Her dark hair was soaking wet, clinging to her neck and shoulders, water tracking down to the tile in quiet drops. I stopped in the doorway. Not because I was startled, but because the room had turned into a risk zone. Cold air was pouring through the cracked vent and her hands were shaking as she tried to keep the towel from slipping. She lifted her eyes to mine and forced a small, reckless smile, like daring the storm to take one more thing. She said, "Do you like what you see?" I replied, "I'm trying to stay calm." Then I did the only thing that was both useful and controlled. I reached to the rack beside the sink, grabbed a second towel, and held it out without stepping into her space. "Lean forward," I said, voice even. She did. A clear choice, a small movement that told me she wanted the help. I draped the towel over her shoulders and pulled the edges together, keeping it high and secure, more insulation than intimacy. My hand stayed on the fabric, never on her skin. I released it the second it was stable. The roof took a hit. I stated, shifting straight into crisis cadence. The primary truss is intact, but the secondary decking is compromised. We need to move you away from the drop zone. Alice blinked, the false bravado melting into genuine exhaustion. She let her head rest back against the cabinet. "Of course it is," she whispered. "Davis was right. The house is falling apart. I should just sign the papers." I recognized the name. Davis was the developer's lawyer, the man who had left a stack of legal letters on the kitchen island downstairs. I had read the top page. It was a formal threat of structural condemnation, a bureaucratic lever designed to force her to sell the inheritance she'd spent the last year trying to save. Davis is a suit who wouldn't know a load-bearing wall from a room divider, I said flatly. I kept my hands at my sides. "Can you stand?" "Yeah." She gripped the edge of the counter and pushed herself up. Her feet slipped slightly on the wet tile. I instinctively closed the distance, extending my left hand. I didn't grab her waist. I simply offered my forearm as a static brace. She gripped my wrist, her fingers freezing cold against my skin. The transfer of stability was immediate. I stood perfectly still, letting her use my leverage to right herself. The moment she had her balance, I stepped back, restoring the buffer zone between us. "Get dressed," I instructed, my tone purely functional. "Put on layers. The ambient temperature is going to plummet. I'll meet you in the kitchen with the lantern." I didn't wait for her to nod. I turned and walked down the hall, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The house was settling into a cold silence, the wind outside acting as a constant, heavy pressure against the glass. I moved to the kitchen, navigating by memory, and located the heavy-duty LED lantern I always carried in my field kit. I activated it, the soft white glow pushing the shadows into the corners of the room. I set my legal pad and blueprints on the island right next to Davis's threatening letter. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It cited vague safety violations and imminent collapse hazards. It was designed to panic a civilian. But I wasn't a civilian. I was an engineer. I pulled a red pen from my pocket and began crossing out Davis's claims one by one, writing the actual structural reality in the margins. Deflection within code. Foundation solid. Shear walls optimal. Alice appeared in the doorway, wearing thick sweatpants and a heavy wool sweater, rubbing a towel through her damp hair. She looked at the red ink all over the legal document. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice guarded. She walked over, placing a hand on the counter. "You're supposed to be assessing the property for the buyer, Jasper, not correcting their lawyer's grammar." "I'm an independent contractor," I said, not looking up from the blueprints. "My job is to document the truth of the structure. The truth is, this house is a fortress. The letter is a tactic to force a panic sale." She crossed her arms, a defensive posture. "I can pay you for your time," she said firmly. "I don't need charity. I have savings. I'll hire you directly to fight the claim." It was a boundary, clear and absolute. She was protecting her dignity, refusing to be a damsel rescued by a stranger. I respected it instantly. "My hourly rate is $250, I replied, meeting her gaze. "I will require a signed contract, and I will need access to the original architectural drawings, if you have them. In return, I will provide a certified engineering report that will legally dismantle Davis's condemnation threat." Alice stared at me, the tension in her jaw slowly relaxing. The transaction offered her control. "Deal," she said. "The original drawings are in the basement. But the basement floods when the power goes out. The sump pump is dead. Then we have a time window," I said, checking my watch. "I need 30 minutes to patch the roof breach with a tarp to prevent further water weight on the top floor. Then we secure the basement." "You can't go on the roof in this," she protested, pointing toward the window where the rain was sideways. "It's a slip hazard." I have a harness and roof anchors in my truck, I stated, already moving toward the mudroom. I don't take uncalculated risks. Stay here. Keep the lantern. The next 40 minutes were an exercise in brutal, freezing labor. The wind bit through my rain gear, but my movements were methodical. I located the breach, hammered in temporary anchors, and stretched a heavy polyethylene tarp over the damaged decking, securing it with batten strips and roofing nails. I didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes at a 20-foot elevation were fatal. I focused on the mechanical process: strike, secure, move. Strike, secure, move. When I climbed back down and re-entered the mudroom, I was soaked to the bone, my hands numb inside my work gloves. I stripped off the outer layers, hanging them precisely on the hooks. Alice was standing by the stove, the blue flame of a camping burner illuminating her face. She held out a steaming mug. "Instant coffee," she said quietly. "It's terrible, but it's hot." I took the mug. Our fingers brushed just a fraction of a second, but the sudden silence that fell over me was absolute. It was the principle of the quiet room. Outside, the storm was trying to tear the house apart. Inside, handing me a cheap ceramic mug, she had built a shelter. "Thank you," I said, my voice lower than intended. I didn't drink immediately. I simply held the mug, letting the warmth bleed into my stiff joints. "I found the drawings," she said, gesturing to a large yellow tube on the island. "I went down to the basement. The water is already an inch deep." I set the mug down sharply. "I told you to stay here." "It's my house, Jasper," she replied, holding her ground. "I wasn't going to let the evidence drown while you were freezing on the roof." I looked at her, truly looked at her. The resilience in her posture, the exhaustion under her eyes, the stubborn set of her chin. The hollow quiet of my highly structured life seemed to fracture. I watched the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she refused to step back, and a sudden gravity anchored my boots to the floor. I didn't want to change her. I wanted to build a perimeter around her so she could stop fighting for 5 minutes. "Understood," I said softly. I unrolled the blueprints on the island, pinning the corners with heavy flashlights. The paper was old, the drafting meticulous. "Let's map the defenses." Before we buried ourselves in calculations, I went downstairs with a lantern and a length of rope. The basement stairs were slick, the air colder, the water already creeping across the concrete in a thin sheet. This was the part Davis wanted. A shallow flood looks catastrophic to someone selling fear. I didn't give him that picture. I opened my field kit and pulled out a compact transfer pump, of the kind you run off a drill battery when the grid goes down. I clipped the intake to a milk crate so it wouldn't suck up debris, ran the discharge hose up the stairs, and fed it out through the cracked bulkhead window to the slope of the yard. "You're carrying a pump in your truck," Alice said from the top step, disbelief and relief fighting in her voice. "I carry solutions," I answered. "Hold the lantern steady." The pump kicked on with a low mechanical growl. The water level began to drop by millimeters, then by inches. While it worked, I did what lawsuits hate. I documented. I used a ruler against the foundation wall, took time-stamped photos of the water line, then photos of the sill plate above it, clean and dry. I photographed the intact joist ends. I logged the humidity with my meter, then wrote the readings on masking tape and stuck it to the wall right beside the photos I'd just taken. Evidence that couldn't be edited by a nervous memory. When the water was down to a damp sheen, I retrieved the yellow tube of drawings and slid it into a contractor bag, sealing the top. Then I climbed back up, wiped my hands on a rag, and set the bag on the island like it was a protected witness. For the next 3 hours, we operated in a strange, synchronized domesticity. The lantern cast a steady glow over the island. I used my architectural scale to measure the original load paths, explaining the math to her as I worked. She didn't just listen. She anticipated my needs. When I reached for the calculator, she slid it closer. When I needed to check a measurement on the opposite wall, she held the tape measure without needing instruction. It was a proximity that required immense restraint. Every time she leaned over the table, the scent of her damp hair, something clean like rain and cedar, drifted across my space. I kept my hands firmly on the blueprints. I didn't let my gaze wander. I channeled the intense pull of the room into the work, tightening my grip on the drafting pencil. Around 2:00 a.m., the wind shifted, hitting the front elevation with a terrifying thud. A notification chimed from Alice's phone. The cell tower must have temporarily reconnected. I pulled my own phone out and sent a fast text to Mark, my boss at the firm, canceling Monday's executive meeting. The signal flickered, but the message went through. She picked it up, her face draining of color in the lantern light. "It's from Davis," she whispered, staring at the screen. "An email. They filed an emergency injunction with the county this afternoon before the storm hit. They're demanding an inspection by their own engineer on Monday morning. If the house fails, they get a demolition order by Wednesday." She dropped the phone on the island. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "Monday?" she said, her voice cracking. "That's 36 hours away. We can't fix the roof and pump the basement by Monday. I lost." She turned away, gripping the edge of the sink, her shoulders trembling slightly. I looked at the email. It was a calculated, aggressive acceleration. Davis knew the storm would cause superficial damage, and he was weaponizing the timeline. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from my pad and clicked my pen. "We don't need to fix it," I said, my voice a calm, anchoring weight in the room. She looked back over her shoulder, a tear tracing down her cheek. "What?" "An inspection isn't a repair mandate. It's a structural integrity test," I explained, drawing a rapid, precise timeline on the paper. "They are betting the house is fundamentally compromised. It isn't. I'm going to draft a counter-report fully stamped with my professional engineer seal. We will document every joist, every header, and every shear wall. When their engineer walks through that door on Monday, I will hand him a mathematically unassailable proof of stability. Professional courtesy dictates he cannot override a peer's certified math without risking his own license." I laid out the steps. Task 1, complete the load analysis. Task 2, photograph the dry foundation above the waterline. Task 3, draft the formal affidavit. I looked up, meeting her eyes. "You haven't lost, Alice. We are just changing the battlefield from their bureaucracy to my physics." She stared at the timeline, her breathing slowing. The panic in her eyes was replaced by a tentative, fragile trust. "You can do that. I'm top tier in my firm for a reason," I stated plainly. It wasn't ego, it was a factual reassurance. "I don't guess, I measure." She walked back to the island. She didn't say thank you. She just looked at the timeline, then reached out and tapped the first box. "Load analysis. What do you need me to do?" The storm raged through the night, but the interior of the house became a fortress of focused action. By 4:00 a.m., the temperature in the house had dropped to 45 degrees. I could see my breath pluming in the air. I was fine, my body ran hot, and the physical focus kept my core temperature up. But Alice was shivering, her teeth chattering silently as she held the flashlight for me in the hallway. I stopped writing. I set the clipboard down. I walked to the mudroom, retrieved my heavy insulated canvas work coat, and walked back. I didn't ask if she was cold. I simply held the coat open. "Put this on," I commanded softly. She hesitated, looking at the massive coat. "You need it. I am currently calculating the sheer strength of a 6x6 post, which requires zero thermal protection." I lied smoothly. "Put the coat on, Alice. You're vibrating, and it's making the flashlight beam shake." She gave a small, tired laugh and slipped her arms into the sleeves. The coat swallowed her, dropping down to her knees. She pulled the lapels together, burying her face in the collar. I watched her close her eyes as the retained heat of the canvas enveloped her. I forced myself to step back, putting 3 feet of cold air between us. The urge to step forward to wrap my arms around the heavy canvas and shield her from the freezing air was a heavy magnetic pull. I locked my knees. I put my hands deep into my pockets. "Better?" I asked. "Much," she murmured, her voice muffled by the collar. She looked up at me, the flashlight beam dropping to the floor. "Why are you really doing this, Jasper? You don't know me. You could have driven back to the city before the roads closed." I looked at the intricate woodwork of the doorframe beside me. "I fix things," I said slowly, choosing my words with extreme care. "But mostly I just see things that are built beautifully, and I hate watching people try to tear them down because they don't understand their value." I wasn't just talking about the house. I knew she heard the subtext. Her eyes widened slightly in the dim light. The air between us thickened, the silence stretching out, heavy and absolute. I didn't move. I let the truth hang there, a quiet devotion, stated without pressure. "Okay," she whispered. We survived the night. The morning broke with a fragile, pale gray light, the wind finally dying down to a dull whistle. The rain stopped. I spent the next 6 hours compiling the data, drafting the report on my tablet, and executing complex load calculations. Alice made breakfast from dry goods, kept the coffee flowing, and organized the original blueprints into a neat, presentation-ready stack. By Sunday evening, the report was finished. It was a 40-page document, merciless in its precision, proving the lake house was structurally sound to a factor of 3. I digitally signed and sealed it, locking the PDF. We sat at the kitchen island, the lantern replaced by a few candles as the daylight faded. The house was cold, battered, but intact. "It's done," I said, tapping the tablet. Alice let out a long, shaky breath. She reached across the island. I kept my hand flat on the wood. She laid her palm over the back of my hand. The contact was a stabilizer, a direct transfer of relief. I didn't flip my hand over to interlock our fingers. I simply let her hold on, anchoring her to the present. "I couldn't have done this," she said quietly. "You did," I corrected her. "You held the line. I just provided the math." Monday morning arrived with the sound of a heavy diesel engine crunching up the gravel driveway. The power grid was still down. I stood in the kitchen wearing a clean, pressed button-down shirt I'd kept in a garment bag in my truck, my boots wiped clean of mud. I looked like the lead engineer of a major firm because, for this hour, that was exactly what I was. Alice stood beside me. She wore a tailored blazer over her sweater, her spine straight, her chin high. The heavy oak door knocked twice. Alice opened it. Davis stood there in a rain slicker, looking entirely out of place in the mud, flanked by a man holding a clipboard and a hard hat, their hired engineer. "Ms. Powell," Davis said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I see the storm did a number on the property. We're here to conduct the safety inspection as outlined in the injunction." "Come in," Alice said, stepping aside. Her voice didn't waver. Davis and his engineer stepped into the foyer. The engineer looked around, his eyes scanning the ceiling. Before he could speak, I stepped forward from the kitchen, holding a thick printed binder I had run off using my truck's mobile printer. "Good morning," I said, my voice projecting authority. "I'm Jasper Berry, lead structural engineer. I represent Ms. Powell." Davis frowned, confused. "We weren't notified of a third-party contractor?" "I am the engineer of record for this property," I stated smoothly. I walked directly to their hired engineer and handed him the binder. "Before you begin your visual assessment, here is the complete structural analysis, sealed and certified. You'll find the deflection limits on page 12, the foundation moisture logs on page 18, and the shear calculations for the lateral bracing on page 22. The property exceeds county code by a margin of 40%. The hired engineer opened the binder. I watched his eyes track the complex calculus. He flipped to the back, saw my official state seal, and then looked at the ceiling where the tree had hit. "The roof breach is isolated to the secondary decking," I told him preemptively. "The primary truss is uncompromised. It's a localized repair, not a systemic failure." The engineer closed the binder. He looked at Davis. "He's right, Paul. The math is bulletproof. If I challenge a certified report of this depth without invasive testing, I'll lose my license. The structure is sound." Davis turned red. "The basement is flooded. A failed sump pump is a mechanical issue, not a structural defect." I countered calmly, citing the exact county code clause from memory. "Injunction denied, Davis. If you attempt to file a demolition order now, I will personally testify to malicious prosecution." The room went dead silent. Davis stared at me, calculating his leverage, and found absolutely none. The law was a machine, and I had just dismantled his engine. "Fine," Davis snapped. He turned to Alice. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Alice said. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. She didn't look at Davis. She looked at the engineer. "You can bill my lawyer for your drive time. Please leave my property." They walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind them. The silence that followed wasn't the cold, empty silence of the storm. It was the expansive, peaceful silence of a war that was finally over. Alice turned to me. The rigid posture she had maintained for the last 3 days finally melted. She didn't say a word. She stepped into my space, closing the 3 feet I had meticulously maintained, and wrapped her arms around my torso. I froze for a fraction of a second, my muscles locking up before I realized what was happening. Then I let out a slow breath, wrapping my arms around her shoulders, pulling her against my chest. It was the principle of the quiet room. The external noise, the developers, the deadlines, the threat of loss was entirely blocked out. I closed my eyes, resting my chin on the top of her head. The physical act wasn't an exploration. It was a shield against the world. I felt the tension drain out of her spine, her weight settling against me as she finally allowed herself to be supported. She pulled back just enough to look up at me. Her eyes were bright, clear, and focused entirely on mine. "You stayed," she whispered. "I signed a contract." I replied, a faint, rare smile touching the corner of my mouth. "The contract was for a report," she said, her hands moving up to rest flat against my chest, right over my heart. "You gave me back my home." She held my gaze breath steady now. "Jasper," she whispered, simple and clear. "Kiss me." Then she reached up, her fingers lightly brushing the back of my neck, and pulled me down. The kiss was an arrival. It was the moment the wandering stopped. There was no desperate hunger, no frantic exploration. It was heavy grounding and absolute, a seal placed on a silent promise. It felt like walking through the front door of a house built to last a century, dropping the keys on the counter, and knowing with absolute certainty that you didn't have to leave again. I brought one hand up, resting it gently against the side of her face, anchoring the moment in time. When we finally parted, our foreheads rested against each other. "So," she murmured, a genuine warm smile breaking across her face. "What's the next step, lead engineer?" "We pump the basement," I said, my voice a quiet, steady rumble. "Then we rebuild." I learned that true strength isn't about fighting every battle alone. It's about knowing when to let someone else carry the weight so you can finally rest. Real love isn't about drama or chaos. It's about consistency, safety, and showing up when the storm hits. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.